Hello, good afternoon, morning, potentially evening, for everyone who has joined us on Zoom today. I'm Mabel Wilson, and I'm the director of the Institute for Research in African American Studies, as well as a professor in the Department of African American and African Diaspora Studies here at Columbia. I'm speaking today on the traditional land and unceded territory of the Munsee Lenape, and I pay respect to their diaspora and honor the past, present, and future rights of the Lenape on their homeland. For the past 29 years, the Institute for Research in African American Studies, founded by the late Professor Manning Marable, has been a fierce advocate of social responsibility and social justice in Black studies. Dr. Marable often prescient reminder in a New York Times article from 1998 that Black studies must utilize history and culture as tools by which oppressed people can transform their lives and the entire societies. Scholars have an obligation not just to interpret, but to act. The Institute serves as an academic resource center for local and global communities that have cultivated an intellectual tradition grounded in Harlem and New York City's rich history and culture. Now, in partnership with our Department of African American and African Diaspora Studies, IRAAS and AAADS continues to expand the array of contemporary scholarship, interpretation, and the diasporic Black experience with this year's special series, Black Counter Cartographies, co-sponsored with the Institute for Comparative Literary Studies and the Center for Ethnicity and Race here at Columbia University. Put together with my colleague, Dr. Vanessa Agard-Jones, Black Counter Cartography brings together diverse scholars, artists, designers, in a series of conversations unfolding over the academic year, exploring the spatial practices of Black life across the diaspora and how they construct counter cartographies of sociality, imagination, and liberation. Geographies represent modernity's production of space and time, subjected to the metrics of markets and politics. Within that sphere, the racializations of peoples of African descent has historically and continues to produce sites of extraction, exploitation, dispossession, and displacement. The field of Black geographies challenges and reimagines modernity's productions of space and time, one that has been abstracted by the metrics of markets and politics. So we couldn't think of two scholars whose work engages this question of Black counter cartographies than Dr. Jovan Scott-Lewis and Dr. Danielle Purifoy, who I'm pleased to welcome today. Dr. Jovan Scott-Lewis is an associate professor and chair of geography at the University of California, Berkeley. He is the author of Scammer's Yard, The Crime of Black Repair in Jamaica, with University of Minnesota Press in 2020, and Violent Utopia, Dispossession and Black Restoration in Tulsa, which just came out with Duke University Press in 2022. He studies racial capitalism, underdevelopment, and reparations as a means of understanding the historical constitution, but also the future of Blackness as a lived experience and political project. Also today, we're pleased to welcome Dr. Danielle Purifoy, who is an assistant professor of geography at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She earned a JD from Harvard Law School and a PhD in environmental policy and African American studies from Duke University. Her research focuses on racial politics, law of development in Black town and communities, and on ecological relations, particularly in forest landscapes. And I'm pleased that I'm joined by my colleague, Vanessa Agard-Jones, who is an assistant professor of anthropology here at Columbia, where she's affiliated with the Department of African American and African Diaspora Studies and the Institute for the Study of Sexuality and Gender and the Center for Science and Society. And also, she is a 2000 MA graduate of the Institute for Research in African American Studies. So we'll begin today with a presentation by Dr. Scott, followed by a presentation by Dr. Purifoy. We will also open to the audience for Q&A toward the end of this event. So please remember to post your questions in the Q&A window on Zoom. So we'll begin with Dr. Scott.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Neighbor Vanessa, thank you so much for the invitation. Danielle, thank you for joining in this conversation with me. I really couldn't think of anybody better to be here and spend the afternoon with today. So I am, going to, share with you a little bit of, my thoughts around the Black geographic, phenomenon that is and was Indian territory, and the ways that that particular geography made possible, new lines and new forms of, geographic formulations of freedom for African Americans in the United States. So in the public imagination, reparations often take the form of the figurative 40 acres and a mule based on General William Tecumseh Sherman's Special Order, Field Orders number 15. Sherman ordered the confiscation of 400,000 acres of land along the Atlantic coast of South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida, and parceled it into 40-acre allotments for settlement by formerly enslaved families. Andrew Johnson, as we know, returned the confiscated lands to Confederate plantation owners, and Black people received, in return, compromised citizenship and a new form of contract bondage instead. Though a temporary remedy, this was a concrete and executable plan for what reparations could have been, as argued by legal scholar Catherine Franke in her book, Repair. That formulation of land-based reparations following slavery, in fact, looked like the extension of the provisions for what was then considered universal terms for self-determination, namely land, tools, and independence. In other words, 40 acres and a mule were not just possessions that were compensation for the labors of slavery, but were the means for self-provisioning and ultimately for the self-fashioning of freedom. We know the story of the failure of Reconstruction, which is famously summed up by Du Bois, who wrote that the slave went free, stood a brief moment in the sun, then moved back again toward slavery. However, a version of this ideal played out in Indian territory through the development of all Black towns, including early Greenwood, Tulsa, Oklahoma, which will later become known, perhaps best known as Black Wall Street. Indeed, Black land ownership in Indian territory, accomplished through a process of complicated and at times dispossessive Black Native relations, was complemented across the country by growing Black land ownership. Still, the geography of Indian territory serves as a meaningful intervention into debate of Black placemaking, especially given that much of that debate is focused on the role of plantation geographies in Black social formation. For sure, the plantation twinned in many ways with the people who labored through the violence of slavery and with their descendants who live now in its wake. Yes, the plantation, served as an ontological geography, meaning a place that has helped to shape fundamentally what it means to be Black, and continues to be seen as instrumental to Black cultural formation and social life. The plantation represents the identifiable intersections of capital, labor, and territory, coherently and cogently understood as racial capitalist formation. The co-constitution, the labor regime of slavery, the geography of the plantation itself, and the subject of the enslaved has produced a totalizing and violent phenomenon. To support this assertion, Catherine McKittrick argues that the plantation uncovers a logic that emerges in the present and folds over to repeat itself anew throughout Black lives. Therefore, the plantation presents a means through which racial geographies and violences make themselves known. Within this formula, Blackness serves as a peculiar quintessence of subjugation that Charles S. Johnson argues is rooted in the soil, forming a tradition in which enslaved Africans saw themselves as twinned, however violently, with the land. The violent disciplining and its cultural and institutional conjoining and reproduction provides what Cedric Robinson has advanced as the historical agency of racial capitalism, the result of which is the geographic twinning of racial subjectivity and the tradition of the plantation. As a result, the plantation has become a central analytic in understanding the operation of both contemporary capital and the ever-present reality of anti-Blackness. As a foundation for Black culture in the United States, slavery's impact, whether as memory or as a continued experience of poverty, continues as a contemporary phenomenon that lives on in economic and cultural as well as emotional and affective ways. And yet, while it dictates so much of the circumstances of contemporary Black existence, it is not without its alternatives. And if one draws on the alternative narrative that Indian territory offers, what becomes available is a framework that might accomplish an act of untwinning or a liberatory repositioning that enables Blackness to be unbound to the plantation. And so while the plantation serves as a meaningful and legitimate geographic prototype for the experience of Blackness, it is not the only form, and Indian Territory as a geographic reference for anchoring Black life and subjectivity is a significant example. The history of Blackness in Indian Territory reveals a meaningful alternative to the racial ontology of the plantation. Indian Territory operates as a reference from which Black Oklahomans and African Americans more generally can draw for a map of their liberation that serves as a redescription outside of the descriptive statement of the plantation, as noted by Sylvia Winter, who explains that breaking with the specific idea of order requires abandoning the need to map its ordering principle by making that order irrelevant. Ralph Ellison mused in his novel Going to the Territory that as slaves, Black people had long been aware that for themselves, as for most of their countrymen, geography was fate. And they knew that to escape across the Mason-Dixon line northward was to move in the direction of a greater freedom. But freedom was also, Ellison notes, to be found in the old Indian Territory. Indian Territory for Black Southerners was a geography of possibility. It was not only a geography of possibility, but one of resistance. The possibilities for freedom conjoined the notion of territory with Black freedom. Despite the conditioning or twinning that resulted from the plantation system, the Black people who arrived in Indian Territory were able to resist its influence through the material and symbolic shift in their positioning that Indian Territory allowed. Through geographic relocation and geography's distinct association or disassociation with Black people's history of enslaved labor, Indian Territory allowed for a revolutionary recasting of freedom. In Indian Territory, freedom was possible not because it was viewed, as was often the case with native lands, as terra nullius, but in a profound way, it was a land that did not comport with pre-existing Black notions of territoriality. Indian Territory offered a necessary framework for reconsidering the geographies that stand as a principal reference for Black geographic relations. Indian Territory represents and represented for those Black arrivals what George Lipsitz offers as a Black spatial imaginary. This spatial imaginary revalorizes Black spaces that have been devalued or abandoned through solidarity, the generation of a community and of a congregation, and the reinscription of value into that community. Indian Territory's legacy produces a viable alternative for organizing Black geographic culture, cultural order, and existence. The ability to reach for this alternative provided the geographic liberty of an open-ended freedom-making that had previously been denied. Thus, Indian Territory provided Black people with new relational terms to place. In Black Atlas, Judith Madera illustrates how African-American writers in the mid-19th century, at the start of the golden age of Black nationalism, rewrote the boundaries, territories, and place of Blackness. During that period, she writes, the idea of territory had begun entering into nearly all domains of life, with Madera asserting that it stood for an altered relation to land that hearkened to something outside the storylines of slavery. In this moment, that altered relation meant that place could be more than a property relation, especially for those who were at the very time wrestling directly with the property and properties of their subjectivity. Even from around the process of emancipation in the United States, Black people responded to the geographic orders of freedom by negotiating, disrupting, and countering controls over their location. What resulted through that process, Ikuko Asaka argues, were alternative visions of Black freedom that articulated aspirations for economic independence and complex understandings of the relationship between race, place, and labor. Going back to Madera, there is no better analytic framework for tracing this unsettling than her use of deterritorialization. In this process, Black people politicized the idea of territory to not only get out from behind white ownership, as Madera says, from behind the object of property, but through their territorial imagination, they were able to unmoor geography from its previous significations. This rearrangement of deterritorialization opened up territory as a novel spatial production that could reconcile both contestation and affiliation. As such, Black geographic formation and spaces like Indian Territory could not only interrupt and dissent against racial orders, but became part of Black people's search for meaningful worlds, worlds of possibility, of freedom, and that which existed beyond it. Indian Territory illustrates how a process of Black world-making through deterritorialization worked in a community that endeavored to realize its freedom in the post-emancipation era. It's that world that many Black social movements have sought to return to or develop for some time. But to get there, they often get stuck on their way in the mire and the limits of the plantation and its powerful framing of the very composition of Blackness, and especially of Black freedom. But in Indian Territory is a history and a model for how the emancipated sought various ways to make a new life for themselves in the country and beyond. Indian Territory offered new beginnings and critically a novel geography free from the tyranny of the still potent specter of the plantation. Thus, for us, we can still look there to find our way through ongoing currents of violence and to certainly provide a broader geographic model for a reparative horizon. While most Black settlers in Indian Territory did not achieve great wealth, their ability to live and work on their terms was an important difference from what they had found in the South. Following Reconstruction's defeat, freedom in the South reproduced the sensation of antebellum life, Black life. Through Jim Crow and the denial of rights, there was little in the way of a life to be made, at least for those seeking it elsewhere. To make possible their freedom, Kenterfield argues that African Americans turned toward ideologies of economic advancement, self-help, and racial solidarity. Similarly, David Chang argues that Southern Blacks held forth a holistic strategy that included the goal of racial uplift through economic self-help, the call to political action, and the notion of emigrationist nationalism, which was held together with the promise of land ownership. Indian Territory made this possible and was best represented through the formation of all Black towns in what would later become the state of Oklahoma. The development of all Black towns in Indian Territory in the post-emancipation era was aided by collective Black freedom, racial identity, and the internal geopolitical climate of the United States. Moreover, they fit the template for freedom, which involved few to no white people, tillable land, and the ability to form self-government. There, in Indian Territory, a sense of Black nationalism and Black determination created a hybrid identity of collective Blackness formed between pre-emancipation Black natives and freedmen and post-emancipation Southern Blacks that fueled Indian Territory's Black promise. From the exodusters who left the South immediately following Reconstruction, to the migration to Indian Territory beginning the decade after, to the Great Migration in the second decade of the 20th century, the post-emancipation era saw several waves of departure from the South in the pursuit of freedom. It was what Carter G. Woodson identified as a century of Negro migration, during which he found Indian Territory to have what he called conditions that were unusually favorable. An analysis of this history and the popular notion of Indian Territory that its Black inhabitants had at the time reveals a novel but material notion of a Black utopic geography centered on the intersecting meanings of land and autonomy. Black communities in Indian Territory organized their possibilities around a concept of geography and ideas of freedom that disrupted the prevailing post-emancipation narrative of Black placemaking. In that narrative, which sadly continues to this day, Black place is already and always contingent and determined by existing racist structures. Instead, through settlement in the territory, Black Oklahomans thought of a racialized geography as a particular kind of freedom dream that was made material. Indeed, Black settlement in the territory introduced a differently racialized geography. It produced a radical Black orientation to place, one untethered to the plantation. Indian Territory land served as a basis for geographic relations that Black people did and still can fold into their imaginaries of freedom. So in closing, Indian Territory supports Ruthie Gilmore's now seminal and oft-cited declaration that freedom is a place. Moreover, its Black history helps us answer the key question that preceded this declaration, in which Ruthie asks, how do we find the place of freedom? And more precisely, how do we make such a place over and over again? What we learn from Indian Territory is that the Black American experience of non-freedom and of ongoing violence have occurred primarily through the rending of Black people's relationship to place. Rather than see Black movement purely as flight from racial violence, we must appreciate with the move to Indian Territory that Black mobility is an ongoing, exhausting yet inexhaustible praxis of Black placemaking. And through that placemaking, Black people developed and have developed a vast lexicon of freedom that is as varied as the sites that they have made freedom in and work towards pursuing what lies beyond it. Many of the geographies that Black people have and continue to inhabit clearly illustrate that we are neither bereft of liberation nor foreclosed of freedom. The trouble has been holding on to the tools, the geographies, and the relations therein to exercise it. Thank you.
So I should go ahead. Thank you so much, Jovan. Give me a lot to think about in terms of the sort of comparisons in terms of Black space making, Black placemaking in particular, and outside of plantation landscapes, which is, and I'm going to actually talk a little bit about what that kind of placemaking looks like within this existing structure of this sort of plantation imaginary that persists, I think, right, certainly in the South, but I think far beyond it. But my work is more focused particularly in the US South. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about called Blacktown Counter Cartographies, since that's sort of the header for our discussion today. And in doing so, I'm going to talk a little bit through my own sort of scholarly intellectual journey to Black geographies, because I didn't start within the sort of frameworks of geography. I started in environmental studies, I started in law and policy, and particularly in African-American studies, sort of intersected with African-American studies. And I think the trajectory, some of the questions we're going to engage with in the Q&A about methods and about kind of various pathways into this umbrella that we're calling Black geographies, I think, are fully in line, I think, with how I came to it myself. So I thought that I would go that route today. And so I want to actually say, just as I start, that the spaces that I will be talking about today are nearly all encompassed within what is now the state of North Carolina. And particularly the spaces I'm going to talk about today are also in the traditional lands of the Eno, Tuscarora, Occaneechi Band of the Saponi Nation, and the Lumbee, Nation. So how I started in this work was actually through a line of inquiry that I think falls under the umbrella of legal geographies, and sort of took me kind of smack into the historical landscapes of the plantation in the state of North Carolina, which is where I am currently located. So the map that you're seeing right now is a map of a place called Pinehurst. If any of you are interested in golf, you might know that Pinehurst is one of the big golf resort towns that they play the US Open in. I think they're going to do the US Open there next year, and is a generally very wealthy white resort town. But it was also previously a plantation in the Sandhills region of North Carolina on the lands of the Lumbee, and which is also the home of the longleaf pine. So this was territory that was historically that enslaved Africans were forced to labor on to harvest turpentine pitch and manufacture these sort of substances for the naval industries. And in the process, the longleaf pine, which is indigenous to that region of the state, was nearly decimated. In the wake of slavery after the Civil War, this space was transformed into a health club for people in the Northeast, particularly from Massachusetts. The Tufts family actually founded the resort that eventually became Pinehurst. And as the resettlement happened of formerly enslaved Black folks in and around this area, you can see that the areas that are all shaded in Black here are the Black spaces. And there's a geographer named Charles Akin, who's, I think, out of UT Knoxville, who back in the 80s coined this term called municipal underbounding to describe the process in which the literal mapping out of territory in the postbellum era, the literal shape of white towns that emerged from the plantation were drawn around the spaces where Black folks settled in order to exclude them from participation in the local polity. They kept intentionally, right, wanted to keep Black communities fairly close, and in some cases you can see sort of right smack in the middle, right, of their towns, but intentionally drew their legal boundaries around those spaces so that they would not have access to a range of things, including basic infrastructure, paved roads, all of those sort of things, any kind of services, and then also probably most importantly for them, right, the right to vote. So this is my entry point into beginning to think about Black geographies and cartography, in particular to really understand how the aftermath of the plantation actually utilize the law to literally draw the boundaries for the maps that we see today, right? And to draw them in such a way that they would circumscribe, right, the communities that were central, right, to their thriving, right? Pinehurst and Southern Pines are both golf resort towns. The industry of golf in this region could not thrive without the labor of Black people who were formerly enslaved on the plantations there. And so it is a continuation of the plantation structure and regime, right? The use of territory, land, and the generation of capital. And as I was doing this work, the primary policy or legal remedy that had been put forth by legal scholars, mostly by legal scholars, but some policy advocates, was for these small Black enclaves to pursue independent municipal incorporation. So to pursue legal recognition or a charter from the state. And so I began to look into, I was suspicious of that as a kind of remedy for the kind of systematic disenfranchisement and lack of services in those spaces. And so I began to look into what it actually meant for Black places to pursue municipal incorporation. And it turns out in North Carolina, the town of Princeville is often put forth as one of the first incorporated Black municipalities in the United States. And so I went to the incorporation statutes to see what, how the state of North Carolina in 1885 set up the incorporation of Princeville. And you can see here that here in section 1, you can see that it's hereby incorporated by name and style of Princeville and shall be subject to all the provisions of law applicable to the town of Tarboro, which is the white town that's across the Tar River from Princeville. And that their ability to actually do one of the primary things that municipalities incorporate to do, which is raise taxes, right, for ostensibly for the Commonwealth, was severely limited. And so they were unable to, initially at least, pass their own laws. They were subject to the laws, in fact, of the white town next door, and they were limited on their taxes. They're also limited in large part, and a lot of incorporation statutes from expanding, right? So one of the, another reason why you might want to create a municipality or a town is to actually eventually grow in size. And many of these places were prevented from doing so. And so this, this analysis of Black towns and legal incorporation really sent me in a sort of different direction in thinking about what then is a Black town, right? If a Black town is not or cannot fit within actually the definition and the sort of the routine practices of what the common understanding and dominant understanding of a town or municipality could be, then what kind of place is a Black town? And more importantly for me, what other kind of model of local place does a Black town represent? And what can it actually teach us about notions of freedom and a different non-capitalist, a lot of these places were not anti-capitalist, but there are some practices that were certainly non-capitalist that they were able to sustain place regardless, right, over many years. Princeville still exists despite having flooded catastrophically 6 or 7 times in the last 150 years. And so I started to pan out and think more carefully as well about the various mechanisms of how Black and white towns in places like Princeville, in places like Pinehurst, in places like Tamina, Texas, how they relate to each other, and precisely how the plantation power regime that was ostensibly abolished after the Civil War continues as the sort of reshaping of the territory from the plantation to the town manifests. And so I worked with my colleague, Louise Seamster, who's at the University of Iowa, with the support, by the way, of the Buell Center for Architecture at Columbia. So yeah, y'all have been super helpful in supporting this work over the years. And we really, we're thinking about theories of colonialism, right, just sort of narrowed down to the level of the local place. And in our research, we described something called creative extraction, which is essentially is how white towns catalyze their own development through resources that are displaced from beyond their own borders. And so we see with the municipal underbounding is this way of keeping a population, keeping Black populations out of the boundaries and out of the polity, but still extracting resources, labor, and other forms of capital from them in order to catalyze their own development. And we identified sort of 3 main modes in which that happens: theft, literal theft of land, erosion through what we might talk about as environmental racism, right? Displacing undesirables like waste, right, from the white town to the Black town, and political exclusion through things like municipal underbounding. And I can talk more about that, but just in the interest of time, this is the sort of framework that I started with, and then wanted to think a little bit more carefully about, again, as I say, what kind of place is a Black town? Because I think the limitations of this framework, however important it is to understand not just that these dynamics exist, but the mechanisms for how it exists and the sort of ongoingness, continuity of the plantation power regime. One of the big limitations is that it still centers whiteness and colonialism. You're still thinking largely in part of what's being done to, or the violences that are being done to the Black place, rather than what kind of place or spatial imaginaries that the Black places themselves are manifesting. And so that process brought me to Black Geographies, and it's actually where I first met Jovan. So I felt a little bit full circle today. So according to McKittrick and Demonic Grounds, Black Geographies are subaltern or alternative geographic patterns that work alongside and beyond traditional geographies, and a site of a terrain of struggle. And so, these terrains of struggle are very much in line with what I've just described in places like Princeville and Pinehurst, and the various mechanisms by which those struggles are played out politically, legally, socially. But there are other forms of thinking about local place that are being manifested in the midst of these struggles that I think were really important for me to explore in thinking about the future of Black places, and not just Black places, actually the future of local place as well. So as part of this exploration, I partnered with a Black visual artist, abstract visual artist named Torkwase Dyson in 2016 and 2017, and a project called In Conditions of Fresh Water. It began as very much in line with sort of the beginnings of this research on municipal underbounding and its impacts on the built environments of the Black communities, both in North Carolina and Alabama. Those were our two sites. But turned out to be much more of an exploration of Black spatial imaginaries in both of those places. And so the project itself, you see here, occurred within this mobile solar-powered artist studio called Studio South Zero. And these are 3 residents of a community called West End. It's just Black community that's on the outskirts of a place called, a white town called Mebane, very similar, to the Pinehurst geographical configuration. And we did oral histories, and alongside those oral histories of place, of Black spatial imaginaries, Torkwase actually started to kind of remap those spaces in a sense through her visual art, which I'll show you in a second. So here is a quote directly from Torkwase. I'll let you read it just for a second. Her work really focuses a lot on thinking through other visual languages of not just direct representation, because she works on abstract art, but thinking about visual languages for Black space and spatiality. And in this partnership, the idea was to listen carefully for how the residents of these 2 places talked about their place, talked about their history, talked about what was important in terms of their commitment to staying in those spaces, their relationship to land, and those sort of things, in order to drive the visual language that she was cultivating in the midst of this project. So this is a view from the church, actually the church grounds of the oldest church in this community called West End. They allowed us to park Studio South Zero. You see it there in the middle of their walking path to and around the church. And so this was where we actually held these, just all in the same space, these oral histories, and where this art was produced. And so this is inside the studio, and you know, in these conversations, so much of what was talked about was this importance of pursuing freedom freedom in terms of political and social freedom, but this sort of distance as well, right, from as far as they could from the arm of white supremacy. And that meant that there were a lot of things, right? They were intentionally being excluded, but there was a way that they were holding themselves apart as well, as a means of figuring out how to create other forms of governance, other forms of relating to one another outside of the kind of mechanisms that they knew were extracting directly from them. And so we listened, and I have a short clip here from one of the residents named Remy Graves, talking about this Black place and this place in West End called The Bottom.
Just a neighborhood, still just like family. That's usually where we go down in the bottom, people down, we call it The Bottom. I don't know why I didn't name it for my time, but like a dead end road, a dead end street or whatever, you go down there and just, we never seen any white people down there. That was where there's nothing to do on the weekend. So, bootlegging and a little party houses or something like that, a place up the street, Rainbow, Twilight Inn. It was just places for people together on West End, something to do on the weekend. And you couldn't go downtown and have a good time like that of color, right. So we got to create our own good time place. And
okay. So you had like local clubs,
little juke joints,
little juke
joints. Good food, good home cooking food.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, live musicians.
Actually, in Melbourne, that I can remember, Betty Swan, you may never hear of her, James Brown. They've been here in Melbourne, right up the street up there at another little club there. I don't know the name. Orange, no, somewhere Orange Bowl or something like that.
Orange Bowl?
I think that was the name of it.
Okay. And so as someone like this is just a direct kind of rendering by one of Torquase's drawings in response, direct response to this interview with Mr. Graves. And you can see here, there is a particular use of architectural language, and you can see a kind of cartographic language a bit in these drawings, and you can also check out more of much more of her art as well. But as a means of really thinking about alternative ways to represent these spaces besides points on a map, right? Besides pictures of decay or devastation, or even just direct representation. How do we think visually about these spaces beyond the sort of direct representation and the kind of colonial representation of the map?
Just a name.
Oops. Okay. Here's just another thing called the triptych that came out of this project. Each of them is named after a direct quote from the residents and their oral histories. And again, these are just kind of sketches and yeah, really using abstraction, architectural language in particular, to think about other forms of representation of Black space. So just a couple of final thoughts here. in my larger work, I argue that towns, if we properly historicize them, can be understood within the genealogy of plantation economies, right, that are now operating under these seemingly race-neutral laws and policies. But you can see the kind of mechanisms that I pointed out earlier as ways that those dynamics can continue apace. And that Black attempts to replicate towns directly in the kind of way that we understand them dominantly confront oftentimes nearly impossible challenges because the town in the Western imagination, certainly in the United States, is racialized as a white space. It is the unit, essentially, right, of building economics, right, at the sort of most basic level in a place. And so in the way that those places developed is actually through extraction. It's not through a sort of building of commonwealth. The wealth comes through practices of capitalist extraction. But I argue that Black places are not simply failed towns, right? That they are sites of alternative forms of governance, social and ecosystem relations. And I'm getting a little bit more into, my future work is getting more current, and upcoming work is getting more into those ecosystem relations. As I experienced really for the first time in this project in conditions of fresh water, Black towns are alternative spatial imaginaries are the starting point for a range of visual, of sonic, right, cartographic forms that gives us other means of representation in space.
Thank you, Danielle. Also, thank you, Jovan. That was fantastic. And so I just want to, before Vanessa and I just sort of engage you for a moment, because I'm sure there are questions out there, please put your questions in the Q&A window pop-up in Zoom, if you do not mind, since this is a webinar. But I don't know, Vanessa, do you want to start, or do you want me to just respond?
Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I actually thought, both of you, and I can see why you've been in dialogue and admire your work. And I think, you both bring up these kind of questions around Black place and the ways in which, given the organizational regimes that are political, economic, environmental, in which Black place is made, there are different ways in which that might transpire. And in particular, one of the questions that I had for you, Jovan, that Danielle actually responded to in a way, was the way in which we might think about Black, especially post-emancipation Black town making, as you described it in, let's say, Oklahoma versus within Black belts and regions that were directly shaped by plantation logics, shall we say. And I think, Danielle, you started to address that. And what's interesting, my family's from that part of North Carolina, from Robertsonville, not that far from Princeville. So I know that landscape quite well. And it's very, very old in terms of the ways in which it developed out of colonialism and white settlement.
And so thank you. If I can respond, there is something, as I mentioned in the paper, Carter G. Woodson said that Indian Territory represented conditions that were unusually favorable, and I think that's very much the case. The fact that, Kenterfield writes that Indian Territory actually represented the non-United States, because technically it was not within the jurisdiction of the United States. It represented, a kind of emigrationist space, in fact. And so, I think in many ways that's exactly right. So while you have the development of all Black towns in the South, you have the development of all Black towns in Indian Territory that are formed, under very specific and I think quite unique circumstances. Of course, that project doesn't last that long. Black arrival, post-Reconstruction, to Indian territory begins in the late 1880s, and, by 1907, the state of Oklahoma is formed, and, the South shows up in a way that, really helps to reconscript, those Black towns into the kind of circuit of white supremacy and subjugation, as, say, a Black town in the South might have continued to exist within. However, I think there was something, even in that brief window, of a decade and a half, under 20 years, that allowed for, a certain kind of practice of self-recognition and self-fashioning that I think, I argue, in the book still shows up, in contemporary Greenwood and Black Wall Street. And so, my argument is that Greenwood effectively begins as an all-Black town or all-Black district just the year before Oklahoma statehood. And so even Greenwood has this moment of practicing this kind of Indian territory, Black sovereignty is what I call it, in the book. And so even if you think about, well, how do you create something like Black Wall Street? How does Greenwood, come to represent, this kind of, accomplishment of Black town making? I think Indian territory and this momentary, opportunity of exercising not just freedom, but sovereignty, of world making really, makes all the difference. And I think we should continue to look to Indian territory, as a model for what it might be, in the context of reparations, to think about what Black placemaking should be, in the wake of reparations, which, I feel really strongly, is to come.
If I could just jump in, because I think I was so happy that you talked. I mean, I'm sure that there are like a number of different elements of your book, Jovan, that you could have honed in on, but I'm so glad that you talked about this, because it actually made me think a lot more about this question of temporality and the I don't want to use the word like visibility, but I'll say legibility of indigeneity that happens, because in the US South, as most of these, the majority, right, of these states, well, some of them are part of the sort of original colonies. And by the time that we are, at the Civil War, most of these places are states already. And that implication to me, and this is from my experience as someone who's grown up in this region of the Southeast in North Carolina, which was one of the original colonies, is that indigeneity as this, as a legible identity here is like greatly diminished in comparison, right, to how indigeneity is articulated and made known in a space like Oklahoma and spaces west of there. And so, I visited Boley, I visited Tulsa, I visited a number of Rentisville, which is where John Hope Franklin grew up. And John Hope Franklin is obviously very important to North Carolina as well. And I was like, I have never in my life actually, but despite knowing that there are indigenous groups that, still reside within this area, there's not the kind of popular cultural production and legibility of indigeneity in this space in that same way. And so when you go to places like West End, West End is filled with folks who have, whose heritage, right, stems from the Occaneechi band of the Saponi Nation. But when you talk to folks there, they'll talk about how like a lot of those people functionally became Black, right, in this space, right? And so there's this blurring, like deep blurring, right? I think it's happening, it happens in a lot of spaces, but this deep blurring of Blackness and indigeneity in this space in a way that I think it gets to be a little bit more separated out once we get west. And so that's been, I want to say, like really hard, like harder to tease out in this space. Certainly not impossible, and it's part of my future work. We certainly have a lot of students, actually, Indigenous students from, Arizona, New Mexico, in particular, come to UNC because they're wanting to understand what indigeneity looks like in the Southeast. Because they're like, I've had students say, like, I don't actually have a sense of it, right? It seems so obscure to us. And I was like, I think that's because it is. And so that it kind of disappears from the landscape as a sort of explicit part of it. And so I do think that those distinctions are really important and are a function of like how colonialism happened geographically as well. There was no space that was not already part of the United States by the time we get to emancipation in the US South. So yeah, just to say that, and thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that begins to answer Dr. Cortes's question in the chat, and I think, from the perspective of Indian Territory, prior to Oklahoma statehood, what you had really was a multiplicity of Blackness that existed within its geography, right? There wasn't necessarily this, political need, to kind of flatten the notion of Blackness that existed in this space for the sake of, solidarity politics or what have you. And in fact, the historical record shows, especially at the beginning, there was significant tensions actually, between Black arrivants, who came post emancipation and Black Native communities who existed, prior to that. And I mean, and just to help clarify, it's important to remember that, the kind of Trader Tiers, right, included, a significant number of who we would identify today as Black people who were, either fully, fully incorporated, members of various Native groups, or were actually enslaved persons to members of these Native groups. Nevertheless, they did represent a distinct kind of Black subject that was seen as different from later arrivants, from the South after the opening of, the land runs in Indian Territory in the 1880s. So, I think for me, what that allows for is one, this opening of what we can think of as the Black experience. And that's why in my presentation, I was trying to, the counter, to the counter cartographies was really countering the plantation in a way. I know typically we use that to kind of counter what we might think of as white supremacist geographic formations. But, I'm also trying to, bring attention to the fact that I think the plantation and overemphasis on the plantation, does a particular kind of violence itself, right, which is flattening the multiplicity of Blacknesses that occur, that are continuously being made. And so to ask the question about, how do we grapple with indigeneity? I think in a couple of ways, right? In one way, it is recognized, it is celebrated. In other ways, it is completely ignored. Carlos Slocum, who wrote a fantastic book on Black towns in Oklahoma, writes, just as you mentioned just now, Danielle, right, that in many ways, for those Black towns, many of whom, share a kind of ancestry, or its members share ancestry that we might consider to be, indigenous, they're effectively rendered as just Black. And I think, that process occurred as a result of statehood, right? When America showed up in Indian Territory, that was the result. And you see the kind of following, expulsion of Black people from Native organizations, right? We know the kind of history of Cherokee freedmen and their continuous, fight for recognition as Indigenous persons. I think that the interesting thing is that there is still a question. So, there is a young woman who I worked with in Oklahoma, in Tulsa, for my book. And, I had gone back to Tulsa last year for the centenary, and she and I caught up, and she she tells me this story, she's an African-American woman, that's how she was introduced to me, introduced herself to me back in 2014 when I first met her. And then she tells me this very fascinating story about how she finally met her dad, who she had never known. And it turns out that her dad, was half Muskogee Creek. And so that effectively made her eligible for Creek citizenship. And so we started talking about that. And I asked her, well, how do you, how do you make sense of that? And, she was telling this story about how she actually felt different. She got her license plate, she got her card, you know what I mean? She was beginning to get these different kinds of benefits from it. Those benefits, passed down to her daughter, who is now 1/8, who counted as 1/8, and we can have a whole discussion about the kind of, the problems of the dolls rolls, etc. Nevertheless, there was a change in her subjectivity, right? She was now something different than what she was before. She was no longer just Black, and it had begun to influence the way that she saw herself in the world. And in fact, it began to influence what world she thought she was able to occupy. So, I mean, I think, what we have to do is we have to think about what are the stakes involved in maintaining what we can think of as this kind of Black political project of solidarity, which effectively tries to align, calibrate and align the various registers of Blackness into almost a single, and singular political claim, versus, opening up, the scope of multiplicity. And I think we should, try the latter. Because I think what we see is that there's a robustness to Blackness. There's a capacity and capacious to Blackness that I think actually encompasses multiple worlds, right? And not just the limited options that have been provided us. So I think that's in some ways how I'm kind of trying to grapple with the question of indigeneity, is that it represents another possibility for Black racial formation that can be Black and also non-Black simultaneously.
Thank you both so much. We have a number of questions that we've not gotten to in the Q&A. And I think you've both addressed beautifully Dr. Cortis's question, but Dr. Cortis, if there's a follow-up to it, I want to make space for you to come in and be in that conversation with our speakers. But I want to quickly seed one thought that I have in the wake of this conversation. And so for both of you, in your scholarship, you're reckoning with the plantation form in various ways, and often via lines of flight or mobility or marronage. There's kind of an ethic of movement away, right? Away from plantation as container. Jovan, I hear you, the overemphasis on the plantation and the flattening that occurs in its wake. Mobility geographically to Indian country and or in terms of policy, into town and corporation. But I'm wondering if you each might riff a bit on the inverse, on immobility and immobilities, and those consigned spatially, geographically, politically, and otherwise to stay and either literally labor still in and within that form. Because part of what I've been curious about, the place where I work, as I know you know Jovan, Danielle, maybe you know a bit of, is a place where there's an emphasis often on lines of flight for Black subjects or for Caribbean subjects, an emphasis on cosmopolitanism and movement and mobility, yet and still there's a constant production and solidification of an immobile underclass that remains either on the plantation physically still doing that kind of labor for bananas or whatever else, or they're hustled into prisons or jails, right? There's a kind of a question of what becomes of the folks, the Black folk who are not cosmopolitan, not mobile, not subject to the kinds of lines of flight and freedom that we might imagine as the horizon. I just want to hear a little bit about how in your methods or how in your theory, or how even in your like broader projects beyond these projects you're working on here, you might be thinking about the inverse and what we do with it.
I love that question, because in some ways, well, I'll say two things. In some ways, like first, like in some ways, the Black towns, at least that I've engaged with, are part of both stories, right? Because let's say a place like Princeville, Princeville has flooded catastrophically. Fortunately, this storm that we're experiencing right now sort of came for us in the Piedmont region and not the North Carolina coast, thankfully, but has been devastated, you know, twice catastrophically in the last 16 years. And when I mean that, I mean like literally 20 feet of water, right? Like wiped everything out. And the story of Princeville is like literally a story of immobility in a lot of ways, right? Like it's incredible, and it's and some of that immobility is a function of like a desire to stay, right? And a commitment to place. And some of that immobility is like a function of how capitalism works and markets work, right? Like if I get funding, like, you know, if I decide to take this buyout, right, from FEMA, so to move elsewhere, my home, right? Like, you know, even setting aside the sort of Black tax, right, in terms of, you know, lower appraisals of homes that exist in places that are not floodplains, there is no way, right, that you could replicate anything that you could, you know, any kind of resource that you could just transplant elsewhere to live, right? And so in some ways, like, people in Princeville like are stuck economically, and they're also committing to place because there is no other place like this space. They have this very strong, I mean, incredible, like commitment to the landscape and to the staying power, precisely because of the kind of place they've created over 157 years, basically, right? Like like here is a place where you don't actually have to have a steady job, right? There are relations, right, that that occur within those sort of spaces that mean that like you're always fed, right? That means that like you don't have the kind of you don't live there as an isolated individual. And I think that's something super important. I think that that gets like lost in the stories that sort of center around extraction, right? So it's important for us to understand how extraction works, right? And important for us to understand like all those mechanisms, but also to understand that like the spaces that you think are lacking because you're comparing them to the spaces that have extracted from those spaces, right? Yeah, you know, those spaces have a very particular kinds of values and modes of place that make staying actually a much more viable option. And it's hard to leave, right? Even if you do want to leave. So that's like one part of it. I think the other part of it is like, yeah, I have not done as much research on spaces that exist, like are like literally embedded, you know, you're in your city. I mean, some of this is kind of semantics, right? Because some of these Black spaces, as you saw with that map, like are like smack dab in the middle of like the white city. Like they're not, there's no flight, they're just there, right? And what I find is like a very similar project. And so there's, you know, project of like place production. There's a whole lot, regardless of whether a town decides to incorporate or, you know, town in some ways is like a misnomer, is a failure of language in ways of like how we talk about these places. But there are similar practices that are happening, and folks create their own organizations, right? There are places where like a neighborhood block club becomes a de facto other type alternative type of governance for a space that's embedded within a government structure that never served them. And so that immobility and like staying power, right? Like I think are things that are kind of like two sides of the same coin in a lot of these spaces. It's hard to leave, but also in some ways like useful to stay. And I think that's something that I've been super interested in as well. Yeah, so thank you for that question.
So I'm reminded of Hartman, who says, staying is living in a country, without making any claim on its resources. Staying, is being in a place that you can never really call your own. And I think the history, of Black life in the Americas has been the struggle over making, being able to make those claims. So I think the primary objective has been staying. There was only this need to move, this desire to move, as really conditioned by circumstance, right? And we know what those circumstances are. I think my argument is not necessarily one of fugitivity or marronage. Mine is one of saying, I think I mentioned it, like it's exhausting but inexhaustible, praxis of placemaking, meaning even in the pursuit of somewhere else, even in fleeing, right, there is genuine placemaking happening along the way. And, what I'm trying to argue for is actually, a more robust and unapologetic claim-making, practice among Black communities. And so even if, your community is at threat of dispossession or of drowning, right? I think what I'm trying to get at is that, what Black people have been denied in the Americas, are these geographic relations, and every attempt to form them meaningfully and in a lasting way, what has happened is some act of removal. And so, I think that's the point, is that, from the snatching, off the West African coasts, right, to the gentrification, in predominantly Black communities today, right, what we see is this ongoing interruption of Black placemaking. And Black people have sought and have struggled to make, place, irrespective of what the actual, conditions are. So even in, the plantation space, we talk about the plantation and plot, right? The plot actually represents, the kind of exercising of autonomy, the exercising of over a claim-making practice of that geography, despite the fact that it was actively violent. So Black folks definitely, know how to make place, want to make place, but are just continuously interrupted in the process. And once that seems, no longer viable, there is this decision to move. Now, I think, what we're talking about is how do we reconcile what placemaking is like in the context of ongoing, dispossession and violence, where there are no alternatives, to go elsewhere. And I think we see that, almost as, a too common practice of living within the kind of political economic circumstances of Black impoverishment. We see what it is, right? We see, what I've elsewhere called sufferation as being the kind of the practice of remaining when, in fact, remaining may not be ideal or even healthy. And so what ends up happening, I think, in those ways is that different ontologies get formed, right? Different worlds get formed as a result. So if you cannot actively pursue an elsewhere, meaning in a material sense, then what you have is this cultural formation whereby an elsewhere is produced by other means, artistic expression, right, or different forms of solidarities, affiliations, and so you do still make plays, but however, it just simply isn't, geographic in this kind of conventional manner. But nevertheless, Black folks, continuously, strive to make deep relations with place, but those relations are continuously interrupted by white supremacy. and we have to find, alternatives, for how to imagine what placemaking looks like for Black people that doesn't necessarily just, limit them to, kind of sites of anti-Blackness and objection, or as constantly, fleeing. There has to be some other way, and I think if we think hard enough, we might be able to find some alternatives. Because actually, when you go, as Danielle is showing, when you go and you talk to folks, when you go and live with people, you're seeing it happening, right? And so I just want to make sure that we, as scholars and intellectuals, are recognizing, the real practice of placemaking that happens, whether it's on the run, or whether it is, in the sight of white supremacist violence, or whether it is in a momentary utopia, like, Indian territory, at the end of the 1880s.
Thank you both so much. We wanted to make sure that one of the questions from the Q&A was brought to your attention before we close for the evening. And this is from Aliou Kwesu Gamprel. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. And this person says, I'm interested in one, how the question of Black towns relates to interdiasporic, quote unquote, separatist movements and the potential of Black nationhood, read Haiti. And two, is there a potential distinction that can be made between the strivings of African-American US-based relationality to freedom and space and other manifestations in and across the diaspora? Oh, and three, lastly, I wonder what the tension between these two presentations in locating what determines Black spaces to be Black suggests for the study of what produces spaces of Blackness. Are Blackness and her spaces permanent, distinct, and derived from the plantation, or do they encircle and consume white spaces, thereby being elusive by necessity? This feels like an open container for final thoughts for each of you.
Do you want me to go, Danielle?
Do you want to start?
I was just waiting to see who's going to pull the trigger first. Okay. They absolutely relate. And I tried to make the argument that, Indian territory represented a sovereign Black space. In fact, what you see in the history of Indian territory and in Oklahoma, I think perhaps not necessarily celebrated enough, but, the state of Oklahoma had, I think, the most UNIA chapters of any state in the United States. In about 5 years or so after Oklahoma statehood, you had the Chief Sam movement, which saw effectively really a predecessor to Garvey's, Back to Africa movement, with a kind of, repatriation. There was a series of repatriation clubs actually all throughout Indian territory, following Oklahoma statehood. And so there was absolutely this kind of diasporic imaginary where, Black people in Indian territory saw themselves as belonging to, a possible network of sovereign Black spaces, right? And so for sure, we can see that Indian territory represented something that could feel very much like Haiti. In fact, one of the, the early, I don't want to say the word pioneer. Anyway, one of the early brothers who showed up in Indian territory, worked, right, to create Oklahoma as an all-Black state. And so we see those corollaries there, and it's not even a stretch of the imagination. Indian territory was meant to be a Black state alongside Haiti, and what later would become the kind of swath of Black republics following colonial independence, or the movement for colonial independence. I think, so for that reason, I think absolutely there, to answer number two, the answer is yes, for the reason that I provided in answer, in answer to question number one. I think, there is still this understanding, that Black place leads to political opportunity. In fact, that was what was most threatening about Oklahoma or Black towns in Oklahoma. The narrative is like, oh, they were jealous of Greenwood's prosperity, financial prosperity. No, in fact, the issue was that, these folks were beginning to enter into state politics and were winning races. And so there was a political threat that Black people, represented in Oklahoma in its early days. And so I think there absolutely is the same relationship in terms of, freedom and space, as, they take place in other places. I'm from Jamaica, and in fact, there was a lot in North Tulsa, right, that I recognized, in fact, about from Jamaica, in the ways that folks there were thinking about their communities, right? They were not thinking of their communities as being necessarily, while actively dependent on external resources, right? Rodney's classic case of underdevelopment. They thought of themselves as being fiercely independent and were absolutely frustrated by the fact that they did not have their own things. And then, last question. That's a good one, a long one and a good one. But I think, what makes a Black place, a Black? I mean, that's the question, right? I mean, I think that's what Black Geographies is trying to figure out. And I think, there's a lot of ways to answer that go back to the issue of world making, right? So what are the epistemological bases by which, a place is formed and is governed? I think that first and foremost helps us to understand what makes a Black place Black. We have to literally think about, well, what are the registers, right? What are the ethics that determine what practice can take place? What are the principles by which people are living with each other in a place? I think those are the things that make a Black place Black. And I think, this can extend obviously beyond, just a space that is 100% Black. And I'm here, in Oakland, and Oakland does not have, a majority Black population, but for all intents and purposes, Oakland is seen as a Black city. And so why is that? And it's because of the kinds of values and the ethics and the cultural practices that are, recognized to make up the very quality of the city. And so we see that those are the terms by which I think, a Black place becomes, or a place becomes a Black place.
Yeah, I think that was all really well said. From my vantage point here in this region, I mean, there's no doubt, right? The question of number one is absolutely yes. Actually, where I'm sitting right now is like maybe a stone's throw from a place, a community that was a Black community that was absorbed, annexed basically into the city of Durham, called Haiti, right? It's the church steeple of the original church that I grew up in, is the Sankofa, and they really very much, right, ground and root themselves in this history and this tradition. And there's so many actually Haitis, right? That's a whole that I don't know all of the history of all the different Haitis, Hayti, that emerged across the US, but there are actually quite a large number of them. And they all are homages, right, to Haiti's overthrow of colonialism, right? That is in their commitment to independence. In Princeville, one of the people who actually was responsible for setting up the first schools in that place was a man who immigrated from Jamaica named Robert Taylor, and started, and there's sort of this pattern and practice that I'm starting to understand, right, of, this communication that's clearly happening, right, across these, across the diaspora, of folks who are basically being conscripted to come to these spaces as they're being formed and to help with education, setting institutions up, all of those sort of things. So this guy, Robert Taylor, who, there's not a ton of history about him, but he became very prominent in state politics in North Carolina, and got his start actually in establishing schools in Princeville. There's, tons more, right? I think that, to be said about it, but I think Jovan is, for the interest of time, has really accurately been reflected, and the answer is absolutely yes. And they it was, very clearly inscribed in the naming and who was setting up the institutions and the parallels between the institutions as well, right? And so I think that, I don't know in terms of a distinction between African-American relationality to freedom of space. What I'll say is that here, and I think the folks that, I'm thinking of folks like Celeste Winston and Adam Bledsoe and Willie Wright, who have been studying, and I've started studying this a bit too, sort of the histories of marronage across the diaspora, but I'm specifically thinking about it in the context of the United States. I think one of the differences, and I'm literally grappling with this right now, is like the legible history of marronage, right, outside of the United States is huge, right? Like people understand when they think of marronage, they're actually not thinking of the United States often, right? And I think that there's something, if you haven't read Slavery's Exiles from Sylviane Diouf, I'm probably butchering her name, it's an amazing book about marronage within the United States that helps to correct, right, the record that, they didn't call, right? And I'm sure this is intentional, right? They did not call Maroons in the United States Maroons, they called them runaways, right? And they use all of this legal terminology to distinguish them from what was happening, from those movements that were happening outside of the US. And so I think there's something, so I think that kind of imagination, right, or sort of lack of like explicit historical connectedness can mean a different framework around freedom that like more that isn't as rooted in this history, even though the history exists. So I think that we just have a lot of work to do to kind of rework that imaginary here and let folks know that like this is this history here as well. Yeah, the first thing that I thought when I saw your third question is something that Zandria Robinson and Marcus Hunter, who wrote the book Chocolate Cities, how they defined a chocolate city for all intents and purposes. And their definition is like where two or more Black folks are gathered, right, makes a Black space, right? And I thought about that, and the reason why they talked about it that way is precisely because of like all of the shifting dynamics of how space can be created and destroyed and all of these sort of things, right? A resistance to the like fixedness, right, of Black place. I think that there's something, I agree with everything that Jovan has said, and I'm like, yeah. And also like there's Black spatial imaginaries that can be produced in all sorts of spaces that are not understood, places that are not understood to be Black. And there are sort of ways that we can engage with that kind of thing as well. And I'll stop there. Thank you. These are like really, really great questions. I feel like I'm going to be sitting with them for a bit. So I appreciate y'all.
Great. This is fantastic. I don't know, Vanessa, if you just want to add anything in the end before I close this out. But Vanessa and I really do want to thank both you, Danielle, and also Jovan, for your brilliant spatial narratives through the material, spiritual, and imagined dimensions of Black geographies. And I think what an amazing way to kick off this series. There are 5 more to go over the academic year, 2 more this semester, and 3 next semester. So it's a really exciting roster of folks. And that will include poets and filmmakers, precisely because I think the ways in which Black geographies form in that process of world making goes through many, many, many different modalities. So I wanted to give a special thanks to our dedicated colleagues, Ms. Sharon Harris, who is in charge of the webinar today, also Sean Mendoza, and our assistants, Olivia Pearson and James Jennings, who are all essential in shaping today's events. And just to share a little bit of what's upcoming, next week on Thursday, October 6th, we're pleased to have a joint IRAAS and art history lecture by Dr. Samantha Noel, titled Tropical Modernisms, the Black Geographies of Wilfredo Lamb and Josephine Baker. Dr. Knoll is at Wayne State University. And then on Friday, October 14th, we'll have the second in the Black Counter Cartography series with scholar Jonette Francis at the University of Miami and artist filmmaker Farron Humes. And lastly, please mark your calendars for a memorial celebration of the life and work of our colleague, Professor Stephen Gregory on November 18th, which will be live at Faculty House in person. And the gathering will also include an exhibition of Stephen's extraordinary photographs. So for more information about this and other events, please see our website at fmstudies.columbia.edu. And I also just want to thank our audience for your insightful questions and for attending this first Black Counter Cartography dialogue. So please take care and be well.
Thank you.
Thank you both.
Thank
This
you.
was really
Take care.
fantastic.